Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep Book Talks. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council. So excited to welcome Christopher McKnight Nichols back to the Doorstep Book Talks. This is your second time on. Thank you for coming back for your book that you edited, Ideology and U.S. Foreign Relations, New Histories. Here's my very marked up copy because it is that good. I learned so much, and I think it's such an important topic of discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I know your semester's already gotten going over at Ohio State. So thank you for taking the time to come here and speak with us about what is going on in the world today and how we can frame it. The news is busting today. We've reached the debt ceiling. Medvedev has threatened nuclear war if Russia loses. Peru is exploding. Brazil, I mean, name a part of the world that has to be dealt with and looked at by the US. And I think it's so important to have frameworks to look at these issues. And this is what Ideology and Foreign Relations does. I think it's such an important book at this moment in time in history. And so I really want to thank you and the scholarship that you and all of the authors have done on this book. And I want to tell our audience that we welcome your questions. Some of you may not have read the book yet. I highly encourage you to go out and get it and send over questions to Chris or us over on Twitter. Today, any questions that arise, we'll take in the second half. But I want to start out, again, welcome. And I want to ask for you to frame the talk today by defining ideology, because I think most people assume there's one definition, and what this book clearly puts forth is that there's many ways to define ideology and many voices. And what I loved most about this book is the voices that came out, the different lenses. And we'll go into more of that later on. But if we could start out just kind of defining the genesis of this book, what you learned about the definition of ideology.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks first so much to you both for having me on and the great team that helped set this up. It's a pleasure to be on talking about another book of mine with you both and this great audience. So thanks for that and your kind pitch. And we learned that we are both people of the Post-it note when we were off earlier. This is my own book and it's that marked up so I can do justice to all the great contributions in the book and the great scholars who've been involved. Ideology is notoriously hard to define. Probably people tuning into this have been wondering themselves to some extent how to define it, why it matters. If it's an it or a them, is it better understood as a plural, ideologies? So one of the little conceits that we do in the book that we can talk about later is that it's a singular title, Ideology in U.S. Foreign Relations, but each of the 5 subsections of the book is ideologies in the plural. So it's a unitary concept to help us organize the book, the history of ideas and ideologies in U.S. foreign relations, but we emphasize the plurality of as you're noting really wonderfully, of views of people, of groups, of change over time. So one of the reasons that political theorists, political scientists, historians, philosophers have a hard time defining ideology in any given moment is because we argue it's not static, right? Ideologies evolve. So that's a key part of understanding what an ideology is, that it's changing. As a historian by the name of Peter Novick, who wrote about objectivity, argued objectivity is like nailing jelly to a wall. It's dripping down the second you nail it up there. Same thing with ideology, I would say. So the best we can do is kind of really unpack ideology in a given moment. What are the key ideas at play? What are the core values and principles? And, to paraphrase several ways that thinkers have defined it, and to help us begin the conversation, I would say, from a historian by the name of Michael Hunt, who's written a lot on the subject, ideologies help us make sense of the infinite possibilities in the world and the complexities out there. They help us distill those complexities, whether we're policymakers or citizens, and they allow us to use our core values and sets of assumptions to organize that. Now, sometimes these are less well known to us. And this would be what a Marxist would argue about, generally speaking, about ideology, that in fact, some of this is a mask for the systems that we're enmeshed in, so that we buy into ideologies, and that helps perpetuate the status quo or a system of inequality or oppression or capitalism. Pick your example there. And while that is an important way of understanding it, another way of thinking this through, I would say, is that often ideologies are articulated by individuals, right? And this is what we can see in the historical record and why we unpack that in this book, but also they're under-articulated or under-examined at times. And so they can function as ideologies, and we can understand as scholars and thinkers and observers and lovers of history, perhaps, in ways that they couldn't, historical actors couldn't, right? They did not quite understand fully the core assumptions that were embedded in their understandings. And even, this is how we start the book, and we were talking about this by email before, even individuals and figures, presidents, policymakers, who argue for a less ideological approach. And one of the things we find consistently in the US foreign policy record, all the way up through the present, is a rhetorical move, at least, to steer clear of ideologies. You find embedded very much in those same positions, ideology itself, right? A set of assumptions and core values that organize the infinite complexities of the world into something more discrete to chart a path forward. Even if they reject ideology, you in fact find ideology. So that's one set of ways to understand this. And we could talk a little bit more about differences between ideas and ideologies, particular operating ideologies in given moments, kind of what's most ascendant or important, and other ones that are out there. But I would also say one of the points of the project is to note that there are main organizing ideologies you can see in US foreign relations that can help us make sense of this moment, where you started, right? Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Haiti, sort of all of the global challenges that we're looking at. And those really important ones in US foreign relations endure. And that's another part of the project. Now they're updated and they change, but some of the core precepts there, say some of those core ideas, core values, as one historian would put it, are there being updated for different moments. So it helps us to understand, for example, the rise of white nationalism and populism in US foreign relations, because it has been there from the start. And our very first chapter in the book talks about indigenous subjecthood and colonial relations as the US becomes a revolutionary nation. And there you see those ideologies at work. Now, obviously, they're not the same, they change over time, but those kinds of core ideas and ideologies very frequently recur or stay there and travel a kind of subterranean and sinuous path over time.
I think that's really important, because it gets to what we talk about here, the doorstep, right? What you just mentioned are doorstep issues, right? How America began, right? Grassroots. So there is a chapter, literally on grassroots in the book. Grassroots, a focus on international relations, the doorstep look, chapter 3. You also in your chapter talk a lot about kind of domestic influence on foreign policy. And I think it's really important as we talk about here at the doorstep and Biden's, foreign policy for the middle class, and what does this mean on our ideology and how we present ourselves to the world. And it was so fascinating in all of these different chapters, even on the chapters on, gender and race and religion, it all came down to a domestic issue that was then put forward into the world as an American idea or part of an American ideology. And I really want to kind of, for our audience who follows the doorstep, to note that this is such an important thread historically that resonates today, that I think has also an impact on what you touched on, Chris, on this no ideology as ideology, right? And Obama was one of the references you made in the beginning of the work, who didn't want to have an ideology, who, perhaps because his focus was on, okay, we're going to focus on US issues, we're going to do what's right by the US. And this is very much, as you said, incorporating this domestic concern and link to foreign policy that I think this book in multiple chapters brings up as so important. And I wonder what that lens was like to you and what thread you saw across the chapters in terms of this domestic impact on foreign policy and ideology.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great comment and a point for listeners to really take on board. It's very doorstep. One of the reasons I appreciate your podcast so much is that set of connections. I think for foreign relations commentators, pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post, you very often find foreign relations as bifurcated or practically inhabiting a firewalled off space from domestic politics, except when you go to, say, a coffee shop or a bar, you find people often, to the extent to which they're talking about foreign relations issues, very often present equivalencies, right? You can pay for this much out of the national budget, or look at, Americans are notoriously bad at knowing, say, how much foreign aid is out there, right? And often scorn the amount of foreign aid when it's just the tiniest fraction of the federal budget. But that said, they think in these equivalencies, which I think is important to understand if you're thinking about worldviews, right, and ideology. And a big part of that, when you actually track it to the policy record, activists, intellectuals, not just policymakers, but the wider community of thought engaged in thinking about the US's role in the world, very often, if not always, I would argue, you find domestic corollaries or direct sort of reciprocal ways of understanding. So, this is very well understood for civil rights, for instance, that civil rights in the US was contingent on a Cold War context and vice versa. So, this for the Brown decision, for instance, in 1954, you actually have the State Department issuing an amicus brief. Does not happen a lot in domestic politics, although the closer you look at the kind of legal record of civil liberties and civil rights questions in the US, the more often you find foreign relations questions there, whether it's because of, as Thomas Jefferson or John Adams might put it, the honest opinion of mankind, right? That the observers around the world are looking to the US. Are you actually practicing what you preach? Or because the State Department had a more invested set of commitments, for instance, foreign diplomats in the U.S. who are being subjected to Jim Crow laws in the American South when they travel around. So those are some examples. I think one through line there that I found in a lot of my work on this set of questions is about who and what counts as an American. So there's a kind of immigration set of questions, there's a citizenship set of questions, and these are very often embodied in the ideologies that have shaped US foreign relations. And one of the reasons that's the case is because of the kind of give and take we find over visions of what the core values of the US are, and who should be protected, right? So if you think about this, if you step back and think about great sociologists like Max Weber and the monopoly on violence that governments have, right? One question is who and what should be protected and who and what should be ruled out. And that works within the North America or the continent, but also in thinking about borders and border making and boundary crossing. It helps you think about refugees. It helps you think about whether or not immigrants are drivers of the American economy. That's both a faith-based question, right? An actual deep commitment to this view, whether or not and it's a scientific or economic set of questions. Do you buy the data on that and how that has changed over time? So I would say that who and what counts as an American as a sort of, it sounds deceptively simple, but it unites the foreign and the domestic in a really profound sort of way, because that commitment then has ramifications out for all other kinds of moments. Think about how terribly the US State Department treated Jews fleeing Europe right before the Second World War. It comes out of, members of the State Department being racist, for instance, and visa policies and other things. But it also comes out of this, a very parochial sense of who and what counts as an American and what the future of the, body politic should look like. And that's been a core battle. So one of the things we say early on in sort of charting what are the main battles in the ideologies, competing visions of democracy would be another way to put that. And I mean, wow, in 2023, we live with that today, right? We live, it's almost, a little past the anniversary of January 6th, it's a country that has suffered an insurrection, however you want to put it, and that is continuing in American politics in this moment.
I'm really struck by what you've been describing here, which is, as you said, the idea that foreign policy and foreign affairs is somehow hermetically sealed from domestic policy is not the case. And just listening to what you were describing now and what Tatiana had been asking you, I really thought that there are two other elements to this, which is that Americans, and this is where the ideological questions come in, Americans wrestle with the extent to what happens somewhere else and defining what that somewhere else is, whether it's in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, affects them at home, and therefore is something that they ought to be involved in. And we've heard those tropes before. We fight people somewhere else, so we don't fight them here. We go out somewhere else to stop a crisis or problem from coming here. But this sense that the two worlds are linked. And then also this point too about our democracy at home, or how we view ourselves as Americans at home, and the extent to which we expect or require the rest of the world to align or become more like us, because we feel either that our own security is involved in that. It does seem that we have this sense that America going out into the world is critical to America's own sense of identity, but also, as you said, the sense of who is American and who is not. And I'm reminded of, President George W. Bush essentially saying that, that his move to push kind of US style democracy around the world was because everywhere in the world, essentially everyone has an inner American seeking to come out. And that really is an interesting vision, to say that the entire world potentially are all latent Americans, and that has some real implications, both, as you said, for domestic policy and immigration, but also for what role the U.S. should be playing in the world. So if you could maybe talk a bit more about that interchange of America going out and America essentially proselytizing itself to make others perhaps more American.
Absolutely. I think you put your finger on one of the core elements at work in a lot of the competing ideologies and visions of American democracy and American democracy's role in the world. One aspect of that's a 20th century phenomenon is the kind of universal set of values that many American leaders and many American citizens, so the Grassroots chapter suggests this, universal set of American-style democratic values that are projected worldwide with relatively little understanding or recognition of the fact that people around the world may have different views about the universal applicability of those. Or to put it a different way, that you see this in the policy record and activist record, that there's a privileging of a kind of moral or ethical set of arguments that are understood to be American or perhaps Western, and that they have kind of subsume other sets or ways of understanding what is appropriate for different peoples and groups. So we start, as Tatiana said earlier, we start the book, and as I was implying, with the juxtaposition that you're suggesting, Nick, of the Bush administration and a kind of what they referred to as a freedom agenda, did not like the term democracy promotion, for instance, rejected that, went with freedom agenda, and this kind of set of universalizing ideas. We'll remember the title of one of his famous speeches was, why do they hate us, right? And it's our freedoms was the takeaway of that. Now, that was short on definitions of those specific freedoms. Was it FDR's four freedoms? Was it, but that said, I think the core of that was understandable to most Americans and to observers around the world, those who accepted it and those who rejected it. And as you see the shift into the Obama administration, one of the things that he comes into office doing, this is how we start the book, the more we thought about it, the more we thought this was a great juxtaposition to prove the point that ideology matters, right? So this freedom agenda, this sort of amplified version of a Wilsonian world transformational set of ideas, right? Actually invading and promoting, Western American style democracy and assuming that it would take off, right? So this is some of the blinders of the Bush administration. What's the exit strategy? Doesn't matter, because the ideological commitment is founded on assumption that others will accept this, right? The Obama administration, diametric opposite. His foreign policy team said that they would elevate pragmatism over ideology. By this, he meant, we will take the real drivers of events. We will be realistic about facts. We will not be idealistic. We will not enter other countries against their will. That became known in the pithy terminology. I suppose, excuse me for saying it, don't do stupid shit, became what that was rendered as. And as one of his main foreign policy advisors, Ben Rhodes, said, who's in the stupid shit caucus when people rejected that, right? No, nobody is. But what's really going on there, if you unpack that, and how we got into some of our current world situational problems, if there were US ways of helping to solve them, which is an open question we could also talk about. But what Obama did was privilege economic drivers, which meant that he did the pivot to Asia, thought a lot more about who the US's main rivals would be, and did not really think that economies like Russia's based on fossil fuel with dwindling population and really just a large military apparatus, were likely to be major rivals for the US. And so one of the things that a pragmatism over ideology move did was, in fact, disguise an ideology that was premised on looking at non-interventionism and economics. And so he said, things along the lines of the fact that Russia was bleeding, that real power is not using violence, but real power is getting what you want through, soft power means, that sort of thing. So really, the Obama administration, as we look, with, I think, clear eyes at the last couple decades, took the eyes off the ball of what Russia was doing. The Crimea annexation surprised them, and they were taken aback. It's not as if Russia had been peeling back democracy under the Bush administration as well. They didn't have any good solutions to that. But the point here is that in this sense, the ideology, the anti-ideology, reveals the ideology at work. And I think that's actually a pretty important insight historically. If you buy what I just said, then you can move this back over time, and not just looking at policymakers, but looking at international organizations and other kinds of groups and peoples who want to project a foreign policy or a set of foreign relations agendas, whether they're in human rights, refugees, or advocating for hard power solutions and in conflicts even. So anyway, I think you put your finger exactly on a couple of the core questions here. And so for Obama, the takeaway there was, when he drew a red line in Syria, he did not intervene, right? He said, okay, the Iran and Russia are backing this power, and we won't actually do that. So for him, that projection question that you're getting at, right? We're not fighting them over there. For him, not fighting them over there also meant not fighting them over here, because he thought the fight was not about hard power.
And how much of that also was what you talk about in your chapter, this idea that it's only about the US. And if you take the long view as you do in your chapter, it's what's good for us. So whether it's ideological or not, or no ideology, it's what makes sense for us as one actor on the main stage, as one power, as the key power, and how much of that is baked into how America looks at itself. Even if we say, oh, here's all these other nations we have to work with, actually, we're the lion, we're the king, or whatever analogy you want to make. It's up to us, and that's it, really. And we might not say it because we're not going to be that crass, but really that's how we operate.
Obviously I buy that, because that's what I argue in my chapter. So that chapter looks at unilateralism, and it begins with our thinking, and I've written a lot on isolationism and internationalism, really committed to thinking through these concepts and then how they play out in different historical moments. And so, the unilateralism as a term actually comes after multilateralism in the mid 20th century, if you look at the etymology and how the word's been used. And I think that's important, because unilateralism has often been, in political science and historians of foreign relations, kind of rejected, right? It's a bit of an epithet. It's not as bad as being an isolationist in the popular imagination, except for those who want that mantle, that very limited group, because multilateralism seems so obvious, right? In the post-World War II era, nations should work together. It's really a question of how they should work together. What's the leadership organization of how nations move in lockstep or not, or collaborate on different kinds of challenges from climate change and fossil fuels to collective security and vaccinations and dealing with infectious diseases. There's a whole host of these kinds of areas. So what I argue in the chapter, and what I think is actually quite insightful for thinking through the long history of the US, is that from the very start, from the so-called model treaty, that was one of the three things that the US government began to do in the revolutionary moment of 1776. They made the Articles of Confederation, they did the Declaration, and they made a model treaty. Why those three things? Why did these committees do them? The model treaty was about how the US should interact with the world and on its own terms. It asserted the US wouldn't pay duties or import tariffs to anyone. Really bold for a weak power, right? And throughout, the first half of the US's history, it was a weak nation. So this unilateral impulse was partly about protecting the US. You can find this in all the sort of great thinkers of US foreign relations and policies, but you can also find this in the letters of regular people. They don't want their vessels stopped. They don't want to be stopped when they're traveling or trading, doing business. At borders, in the water, et cetera. They want to assert a kind of neutral rights in the world, mind their own business. And so, what I say in the piece, and you can see this in lots of different, actually, political parties over time, it comes from across the political spectrum, arguments for unilateralism. It doesn't need to operate as an ideology to function ideologically, is something that I say, which really fundamentally means that it as an organizing set of principles, as a framework for action, unilateralism can actually be more visceral. So we could think to the very immediate past, and where I start the chapter, and a couple talks I've given on this, is the Trump administration, right? People were surprised that he's pulling out of so many things. Well, not historians like me, because we've studied these ideas and they go very far back. They may be the primordial soup of how Americans have thought about their role in the world, transactionally, what benefits Americans most. So if you're thinking about those, what I said earlier, and definitionally, what are the core values and assumptions that organize the infinite complexity of the world into discernible, discrete paths forward? How does it benefit me? Why would I be involved with other countries? Why spend blood and treasure elsewhere when it can go at home? What's the, and then other elements of that as a weaker nation, or how should the US operate? Another piece of that puzzle would be on unilateralism. Operating alone in the world gives the US a lot more autonomy, right? So sovereignty and autonomy go there. And you find this in lots of folks who are hawkish, right? You don't have to be pacifist. In fact, you could be more open to territorial land grabs and aggrandizement if you're following a unilateralist orientation in foreign policy. It isn't just insular, it could actually be quite expansive. So, this set of ideas embedded in unilateralism, self-sufficiency, non-entanglement, operating alone in the world, incubating new industries, for instance, protectionism can go in there. We've seen that recently. We've seen that in lots of different moments in US history. So, I think that that's useful for us in understanding why there's such a strong group in the American population today, and has been in lots of other moments, who want to pursue a kind of go it alone path in the world. As early Cold War conservatives called that, they called it some combination of the free hand. And they didn't mean that economically. They meant the US should have a free hand to follow its best interest wherever they go, especially, interestingly, after the Second World War, when the US has an enormous amount of power. They say, don't do the Marshall Plan. Don't put bases around the US. Instead, focus on exactly what is in the US's best interest. And we've seen that again in the 2010s and 2020s. And it wouldn't surprise me if we continue to see that recur, because these ideologies and core sets of ideas and convictions are so powerful.
But I just want to touch on, pick up on a point from there, and maybe ask you and press you on this question. We talk about that there are these different ideologies, these different strains, and yet for the last 70 some odd years, a certain combination of ideologies that have coalesced together have been the dominant ones, which is the US is not isolationist. The US needs to be involved in the world. It defines its interests primarily through the Euro-Atlantic theater. It sees them primarily through geopolitical terms. And this has been relatively enduring. And even with new ideological and old ideological things bubbling up. So we have people saying, really, with the crisis that the planet is facing, really climate should be at the center. Mm-hmm. You talked a bit about the pivot to Asia. Many people say that was a good idea, but we seem to be getting pulled back to Europe. Climate was a big talking point for the Biden administration in 2021, and yet in 2022, it's, well, we'll get to the climate, but let's take care of Russia first. And if that means burning a bit more coal to deprive Russia of gas income, then we learn to live with that. Is there a certain, how to put it, that people come in with different new ideologies, or saying we should put climate first, or we should really refocus on women, peace, and security, and yet we kind of go back to a kind of plastic that says yes, yes, but really we go back to Europe, we go back to geopolitics. Is there a certain dominance of a particular ideological frame for the US, and what would change that? Donald Trump certainly tried to be much more transactional, tried to kind of break some of these approaches with perhaps some degree of success. But the Biden administration, we've seen how much we've snapped back to these older models. But when you're looking at these other ideologies, I mean, do you see something where down the line America says, look, we're going to focus much more on climate, we're going to look much more at the Western Hemisphere, we're going to put women, peace, and security at the top of the agenda rather than other sets of priorities? Or is there a certain thing, people come in with these different ideas and then they get kind of converted, ideologically converted into what has been the dominant US approach for the foreseeable past?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some of the predictions I'm not sure I could make here, but I'd love to brainstorm with you all of that. But that said, I think, so in the historical record, one of the things you find for transformations of the ideologies is moments of crisis. The crises reorient the priorities. So, even if what you're describing in some ways is about a limited reorientation of priorities, sort of the values filter for a dominant set of ideologies, or singular ideology. Here you might say, something between the rules-based order, liberal internationalism, and a kind of set of multilateral commitments, just broadly defined, maybe too broadly defined. And then within that, the filter is, foreign policy for the middle class, or putting top of the list climate change. The aberration there, of course, is the much more unilateralist turn of the Trump administration, or the more idealistic kind of coalition of the willing of the Bush years, but still within that same systemic organizational system, right? So the system is mostly the same, but it's kind of how the hierarchy functions within it, just to kind of give you a rough social sciencey sort of way of thinking of that. But these moments of sharper crisis or transformation, I think, are the ones you need to look for. And they could be pretty cataclysmic. So, imagining climate change is a good example here. When it gets so terribly bad, it's not just, Department of Defense saying this is a security concern. We're all, from insurers to multinationals to citizens, we are all deeply affected, but so deeply affected that then it follows that isn't just a top line filter and a kind of multinational set of commitments, multilateral set of commitments, but something much bigger, say a new kind of coalition formation. And I point to a few examples just to give us, not to be quite so abstract. One of the chapters in the book that's gotten some attention that I think is great on this is by Andrew Preston, who's a scholar at Cambridge, who also edited the book that I talked with you about before with me, Rethinking American Grand Strategy. And his chapter is about fear. And one of the turns in foreign relations that we've been seeing recently in scholarship is a kind of affective or emotional turn, thinking about other kinds of drivers of thought and practice and policy. And, won't surprise people watching and listening to the podcast that that fear, the sort of central paradox that's been evident since at least 1945, is that fear has been a major driver of one of the most secure nations in the world, maybe in world historical terms. Now, of course, there's nuclear wars is a cataclysmic existential thing to fear, but to understand why Americans were more afraid of North Korea than South Koreans were afraid of North Korea just a few short years ago by polling, you need to unpack the relationship between fear and national security, for instance. And there's a political rhetoric that does service to that, right? So you could argue from a very transactional, self-interested way, the military-industrial complex benefits, certain political parties benefit from militarization and fear. But on a deeper level, or a different kind of level of thinking that through, what Preston argues is that, this tendency to fear the worst was really never more acute than when US power was at its height. And that perhaps what you're getting at, Nick, is that, fear of climate change is insufficient or we're not leveraging it well enough. But perhaps when the US's power is more diminished, you could see a crisis then reorient that fundamental ideology that organizes things. And I would add another chapter in the book that also people have liked and that's been useful in pushing forward this kind of conversation is Jeremy Surrey, a professor at UT Austin, wrote a chapter that's pretty thought-provoking on freedom as an organizing ideology. And he says, freedom maybe isn't best understood as an ideology, but if you look at it, rhetorically, how freedom was used, then you can add in and look at different eras. And he argues that there's an era of a freedom from, an era of freedom to, and an era of freedom over. And that's roughly sort of the Monroe Doctrine era is the classic example of freedom from. So freedom from European meddling in the Western Hemisphere, freedom from other kinds of interventions as the US economy is developing, and then a freedom to the sort of Woodrow Wilson era, World War I-ish to the Second World War. And then he argues that sort of Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War marked a period when purposefully extending kind of a freedom over other nations, or as Rousseau said, something like forcing them to be free, this gets us back to Bush, became an essential task of US foreign policy. And so if you buy that trajectory, and he paints that a mere 6,000 words, so there's a lot missing there, but it's a great thought-provoking kind of thing for the audience to think through, then perhaps you can see different breaks just from those moments, 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century, as ways of reorganizing those ideologies. So what would the next one be for the US? We could attempt to tackle that, but I think those are some useful ideological ways that the scholars in the book try to address exactly your concern.
Before we move on to a question that I'm really, really interested in and a chapter I'm really interested in, there's a question in the chat from our audience. Thank you. How does the myth of American exceptionalism play into the formation of American ideologies? And I think that kind of goes along with what we've been talking about. So I wanted to insert that question here.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. One of the most fundamental ideologies at work in US foreign relations is exceptionalism. And it's amazing to see how policymakers and citizens invoke exceptionalism. And so we have a few different chapters that talk also about synonyms. In some cases, civilization, American civilization, is seen as a kind of synonym for exceptionalism. It's this unique derivative of a kind of Anglo-Saxon or Anglosphere kind of civilizational project that only the US can fulfill. So in different eras, you see that. There's a great chapter in the book on civilization in American presidential rhetoric by a scholar named Ben Coates, who's at Wake Forest, who talks about this. You also see exceptionalism playing out in kind of providential millennialism and religious arguments. And so the sort of US mission meets this kind of divinely ordained project of exceptionalism that no other country can embody in this logic. So you see this in, for instance, mission literature, even intended for children. There's a chapter in the book that's really fascinating and worth thinking about as well, on how ideologies are projected generationally to kids. There's another chapter in the book so that's by Emily Conroy Crutz, who's a scholar at Michigan State, but there's a chapter by Daniel Imawar at Northwestern on Star Wars. And so, you can think about mission literatures intended for kids projecting a kind of exceptionalism, and then a kind of anti-exceptionalism embodied in things like Star Wars, where George Lucas was rejecting both kind of modernization theory, as Americans had developed a kind of vision for how other nations should modernize and push back against socialism and communism through a kind of step series, as Walt Rostow, the theorist, used to put it, to sort of the jump off into modernity. And Lucas rejected that, and actually in the Star Wars series inculcates in kids a kind of vision of the US as the empire, right? What's amazing about this is the US is not, they're not the good guys, they're not the rebels. A lot of Americans probably think that they are at this point, but that's not Lucas's point. And in fact, what Lucas is talking about in that piece that gets back to this exceptionalism kind of myth is that doesn't the empire think that it's doing right and saving the universe? And what Lucas wants you to note is that the revolutionaries, the poor people on the receiving end of the empire, are the really exceptional ones. It's sort of perpetuating a kind of authentic, force-driven, cosmic, kind of world transcendent set of global, universally transcendent set of ideas. Imawar does a better job than I do in explaining that, so I highly recommend you read that chapter. But back to the core question. The myth of American exceptionalism is embedded in virtually all American ideologies related to foreign relations. It's either in there embedded as a justification of some sort or outright rejected, right? So in order to, for instance, anti-imperialists to make the argument that the US should not take other territories, it argues the US is not like other empires, should not be like other countries. And then you either see an argument there for exceptionalism, that American democracy requires not ruling people, alien people against their will, to use that terminology, or that American democracy is like other kind of Western burgeoning democracies at the turn of the 20th century, and therefore shouldn't do that thing that monarchies and other kinds of governments have done in the past. So we see exceptionalism at work in the vast majority of ideologies and ideological debates about US foreign relations. It's a really crucial piece of this puzzle. And many scholars have argued this. And I'll add one more piece. Michael Hunt's groundbreaking work on this that we amplify in our project argues that American exceptionalism is very much enmeshed with, as well, racial hierarchies. And so understandings of first, before the social science literatures of the late 19th century, really mid to late 19th century, made arguments for scientific racism. Americans performed their own exceptionalist versions of this. And then in the late 19th century into the 20th century, start adopting kind of a classification of civilizations and hierarchies that is very race-based and is very exceptionalist in that form, that somehow Americans, who and what counts as Americans, were exceptional racially and civilizationally. And that therefore was the grounds for the kinds of expansion around the world and a kind of justification for the divine project that was allowing the US to become first outcompete other rival powers and rising powers in the world system, and then become kind of hegemon after the First World War.
Nick, you got something?
Yeah, no. I just to add on that too, just a point about exceptionalism from the questioner. Also, I mean, I think we see that in the idea that even to this day, that the United States has a special quality to knit together coalitions that no other country seems to have. So we see this argument, and I mean, it's playing out right now in Europe, the idea that only the United States has the capacity to hold together a coalition to support Ukraine, that the Germans can't do it, the French can't do it, the British can't do it. And that in East Asia, the idea that the United States is the only country capable of knitting together a balancing coalition to China. And I think, again, this idea that, and I think somehow also that this idea that the United States has somehow exempted itself from some of the laws of history and social science that affect other countries. And I'm wondering, and this may be, for another time, but the extent to which, the experiences of the last couple of years, including January 6th, are reminders that no, the United States is not exempt from some of the same rules. And perhaps that also goes into the second question we're getting in from the chat, because of course, one of the things about American exceptionalism that I remember very clearly from 2001 was after 9/11, when we went into Afghanistan, that we were not like the British, we were not like the Soviets. We would succeed in Afghanistan where the British and the Soviets had failed. And from the chat, we have the failure of the Afghanistan pullout followed rather quickly by intelligence and military success of supporting Ukraine against Russia. How do you think the US is viewed today by allies and or potential allies? A partner that they can rely on? Because certainly a few years ago, or 2 years ago, the narrative was the United States is unreliable. Now is US reliability back? And perhaps how does this tie in again to this American exceptionalism question?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there for us to grapple with. I think, so to your initial point, one of the things I want to make clear, at least from my read of the history, is that exceptionalist arguments can be positive, even if we accept the fact that they're a myth, right? That in fact, the US is no more exceptional by virtually any grounds or variables than other countries or peoples. Now, there are a few places we could argue that the US may be, in fact, exceptional. Mass shootings, for instance. It's a carceral state today, right? We have more people in prison as a percentage of population, or our peers are countries that the US would reject as peers, generally speaking. So there are a few places we could argue that the US is, in fact, exceptional, but they do not ground us in anything glorious, I would argue. But exceptionalist arguments can be very positive, right? If you think about the self-sacrifice that's required to die for a cause, a belief in exceptionalism, particularly if you think in war and intervention, right? A belief in exceptionalism to help others, to spend blood and treasure, however potentially misguided that might be, that exceptional grounding for it may do positive work. And one of the things that I think is important to take away from projects like ours and conversations like this is that ideology isn't necessarily good or bad. It's not that, you know, Obama's rejection and Bush's acceptance of a kind of ideology shouldn't lead us to any particular perspective just from those presidential views, but that unpacking ideology, interrogating it, understanding its role, that's crucial. So, you know, we could look at other moments of exceptionalism and say, okay, it's better or worse, leveraging exceptionalist arguments for particular ends, you know, we can make value judgments about, but I just want to kind of lay that out there, which I think is important. You know, I think one of the things that I'll confess, and I don't know how you feel, Nick and Tatiana, but a lot of scholars, when I talk to them who know a ton about foreign relations, US foreign relations history, the international system, have been surprised about is that many of us made assumptions about a consistency across US presidential administrations, that the US would, generally speaking, has in the past and has continued to the near past, abided by most of the pledges made in foreign relations, commitments of presidents, commitments of secretaries of state, agreements, treaties, non-binding, binding, all sorts of commitments. One of the things that the recent past has shown is that not just at the level of security alliances and actual allies in hot combat, but also just fairly undramatic, unimportant commitments that are ruled by norms, not laws, are things that can be peeled back. And I think to the question from the audience, it's a very astute one. Is the US a partner other countries can rely on? Bottom line. And if you're an observer around the world, I think your clear takeaway of the last 6 years, and if you want to go farther, 20 years, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, is no. The US is not a partner that you can rely on in a longitudinal sort of way. You might be able to rely on the US through 1 or 2 presidential administrations. You probably should not bet on relying on the US as a reliable partner moving forward, I would say, as a world observer thinking about this. And in the way that you might have been able to believe that between Eisenhower and JFK, a generational transformation happened. And I could point to the differences in foreign policies, but as a general sort of yardstick of what was going on, that shift was not one that observers around the world thought would radically shake US foreign relations and commitments to allies and rejections of adversaries. So I think it's a really important set of lessons that the world is learning from US politics, and Americans, back to your other part of your question, Nick, Americans are learning about their own government, that we are a nation that much more relies on rules, not on rules, but on norms and on practices of solid people who we assume will mostly keep their word. And that is not necessarily the case. The US may have been incredibly fortunate to have at least decent leadership over time and not have as many guardrails as now seem useful in foreign and domestic and at the intersection of the two. Just think about the debt ceiling, the debacle that is on the horizon, right? Virtually everyone agrees the US shouldn't default on its debts, but for particular political reasons, people in Congress are going to use that as leverage to make particular kinds of cuts to programs or other sorts of things. This is just one of many sorts of examples where outside parties, lenders, Individuals within the country who are also owed may not receive what they are owed. This is the sort of core commitment that nation states make to pay back their loans. This is what we do. You know, my house will be foreclosed on if I don't pay my loans. The U.S. doesn't. The U.S. is a kind of hegemonic force. That's not the case. But again, back to that question: is the U.S. a partner that other countries can rely on? You look at these kinds of moments, and you have to think probably not. And if you're a clear-eyed, sort of realist perspective, that's, you know, I think recent events should shake us all, and certainly have shaken the international community.
Well, that's kind of pessimistic. So I'm gonna reel us back into optimism, because that's my role here at the Doorstep. Because I do actually think that there's a lot of optimism in this book. Particularly, I'm gonna look to the chapter 4 on the gender lens and change, and chapter 12 on Fleming-Cottrell and the idea of the international citizen. Those were 2 chapters that really resonated with me. And I think the power of this book is the idea that this isn't just a white male dominant ideology. I mean, it has been, but there is now room and scholarship looking at how different voices have influenced foreign policy from the bottom up. And certainly Fleming-Cottrell, you know, an unknown figure that did so much at State Department, at the White House. I mean, these figures that now need to be looked at in their role, and certainly her role in transforming this idea of international citizenship and bringing forth the voices of those underprivileged in poverty. And I think that these new voices and looking historically at the voices that were underserved, you know, race, gender, sexuality, that's missing from the book. But, you know, here's a new opportunity for us to kind of bring different ideas of change, because I do fundamentally believe that change happens from the ground up, that we need to be looking at, as you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, Chris, what's being talked about at the bar stool, right? What are people really concerned about? And these cultural influences. And I do think, I just want to get back to the Star Wars chapter, because I do think that was super interesting to know, you know, well, what are people talking about? You know, okay, we're not at the water cooler anymore, but, you know, online, on Twitter, for as long as Twitter lasts, right? This powerful idea of Yellowstone, you know, I don't know if you've binged that yet, but, you know, of 1883, 1923, this idea of freedom that we talked about today, and you know, and the idea of the individual making change. And I think that, and in each individual having a voice, the power of Gen Z to change the way thought processes work, that it's not just the elite think tanks in DC making foreign policy decisions or shaping ideology. I think I want to kind of ask you about this, what I saw as an optimistic note, and 2 great chapters. And also there were threads of this discussion in other chapters as well, but these were the chapters that stood out to me.
Absolutely. Thank you for highlighting those, because those are some of my favorite chapters of the book as well. And one of the things that we thought about, my colleague David Milne at the University of East Anglia and I, in editing the book, was to put together these kinds of voices and chapters and to find scholars who really were experts in, you know, African-American intellectual history and foreign relations, you know, who are doing cutting edge work on grassroots understandings of foreign relations, the role of women's international thought, you know, and how that was grounded not just in how women interacted with the international system or in US foreign relations, but actually sort of the whole broader systems of ideology as they adapted to the fact that there are suddenly lots of women with advanced degrees and significant activist orientations changing those foreign relations, altering the discourse, right? So that there's a chapter by Katrina Rietzler in the book on that, women's international thought. She's at the University of Sussex. And there's a great chapter by Brandy Wells on Fleming-Cottrell, who you mentioned, who is a home economist, you know, an educator, a thinker, and then the chapters about how she thought of herself as an international citizen, and the kind of work going back and forth between being a kind of agent of the US government, agent of the state, an academic and thinker, and someone with broader commitments, well beyond the parochialisms of a nation state, right? Trying to do more particularly as a Black woman in a world in which, she faced all kinds of oppression and all sorts of challenges. And I think one of the things that you note there on an optimistic note, and generally I am optimistic about some of these things, but is the US a reliable partner right now from a world historical perspective? Not so sure. But from how does change happen, I think you're exactly right. And I think a lot of people who've studied ideology have defaulted to looking at just those foreign policy makers, the National Security Council, the top institutions and think tanks. They all have their roles in this conversation for sure. But I think the chapter that you also mentioned on Grassroots by Michaela Hoeneke-Moore from the University of Iowa really, and then she's writing a book on the subject, which I think will be groundbreaking, really helps us to understand that through close attention to the ways that regular individuals thought about foreign relations, your average American citizen has a much more robust view of foreign policy, a deeper ideological set of commitments than we often really recognize fundamentally. And one of the things she observes is that, a bottom-up approach shows there's a diversity of foreign policy perspectives across the landscape. And perhaps this gets back to Nick's question, how does change happen? Perhaps we're looking at the wrong actors, or if we think that there's been this consistent through line, perhaps we're looking at the wrong peoples and groups. And if you look to regular folks, she says that this diversity of foreign policy perspectives defies conventional binaries, right? It rejects isolationism and internationalism. It pushes back against, facile understandings of elites versus the masses, or hawks and doves. And so, one thing that she looks at GIs coming back from the Second World War, and some of her broader work is about Black GIs coming back from the Second World War. And one of the things that they evidence is a real view that they were proud of their service in the war and absolutely did not want the US to take on the Cold War internationalist role that it winds up taking. They did not want lots of US troops committed around the world for peacekeeping. And they had very good arguments for why. So look to regular folks, right? Look to women, look to people of color, look to activists like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which I've written a lot about. I think we need to think more deeply about the varied landscape of ideologies and ideological actors. And I think that's where, Tatiana, you get to this generational piece too, that I've been puzzling through based on a couple of these chapters here. And I'd be curious to kind of plant this seed with the audience. How are the kinds of ideologies that we are exposed to as kids then largely, or at least partly, determinative of the kinds of foreign policies and worldviews we have later, right? And right now, we three in this whole audience, they're all adults maybe, are thinking that they have fully formed ideas. They want to learn more and think more. But are those core assumptions that I was describing earlier embedded in formative stages of your life? And they come through, not through talking or listening to presidents or foreign policy documents or studying all the stuff that's behind me, right? No, they come through comics, cartoons, what your parents tell you, what you see on the street, right? All kinds of different interactions. They come through Star Wars. They come through mission literature intended for kids, right? They come through life experience and cross-cultural awareness. They come through Twitter or TikTok, and not through, sitting in conferences or understanding that sort of thing. And so, it's often, in other words, off stage in the scholarly study of ideology, all of those formative parts of what makes for the ideologies of human beings later. And I think on the optimistic side, the fact that in the US we're seeing a lot more younger people voting and registering. We're seeing more women of a younger generation elected to Congress, for instance. Those generational dimensions that we're witnessing right now are the kinds of things that then scholars in a generation will look back at and say, like this book does 100+ years later, those are the kind of formative moments that came out of an ideological milieu of things like Star Wars, right? Suggesting that in fact, the US's role in the world isn't so benign, that perhaps the exceptionalism that we found some of our arguments on, even our best ones, need to be better interrogated.
Just saw the comment coming in about not forgetting the role of Eleanor Roosevelt. We're playing her role in focusing on human rights and on also really on getting the United States involved and sustaining its role in the United Nations. And I don't know if we have time. I think this may be for another podcast, but the question of global biodiversity as preserving and protecting that as an organizing principle for foreign policy, but certainly this is only, I think, the start of a conversation rather than its end. Tatiana, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad that we're leaving off on an optimistic frame of mind, looking at younger generations, and that's your next book, Social Media Impact on Foreign Policy Ideology, Chris. But for now, this book is Ideology in U.S. Foreign Relations, New Histories. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Everybody get this book. It is so thought-provoking, such a fun read, so many different ideas. Thank you for coming back to the Doorstep, and we can't wait to have you again.
Great to be on the Doorstep with you both. It's such a pleasure. Yeah, and hopefully people will read and think. Each of the chapters is very accessible, and at the end of the day, every single one tells us something about the world we live in.